want to thank you all for joining us again on this film. It's a very important film, Dark Waters, and needs to be seen by more people in the United States. And I wanted to thank Carol Denny, who connected with us with the actor Jeffrey Grover, and he also connected us with Rob Bilott, the lawyer that portrayed in this film. So I guess first of all, we'll open it up if Jeffrey or Rob want to make any comments first.
I'd like to yield to Rob.
Okay.
Steve.
Okay.
Because Rob is the man of the moment and certainly deserves all of the attention and time that you guys can get. So
okay.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. I have really an honor to be here tonight. I really appreciate being invited and the opportunity to speak with all of you. And really, I'm happy to see more opportunities to have the film shown. I really appreciate it and happy to talk with you this evening and answer any questions.
Are there any questions or anyone? Carol.
Well, I do have a question. I've always wondered, you know, some movies make some changes along the way to suit the narrative. And this movie is so fascinating to me. And I'm wondering, did Dupont really do the big discovery dump that is pictured in the movie with so many boxes? If people aren't familiar with that, the idea is the answer to what you've requested is in there somewhere. But if you throw it into the middle of an enormous amount of material, and you can imagine how much material Dupont would have to just obscure what you requested. I'm just fascinated by that and many other aspects of the movie. So that's my first question.
Yeah, you know, in fact, you know, I've spoken to several law schools and universities after the movie has come out as well. And that's actually one of the aspects of it that I focus on, which is, I don't know if this story and all of this information, frankly, ever would have come out or we ever would have pieced it together if it had started today. You know, the way a lot of legal proceedings work now, everything's on computer disks, everything is stored on hard drives. And when a lawsuit like this one starts, the way the process works now is if you're the person like Mr. Tennant bringing the claim, you have to go to the other side, say DuPont, and you have to tell them what search terms to use to look through all of their documents. They then search through all their documents with whatever you tell them. Now think about that. Think about this case. We didn't know what this chemical was. We didn't know that there even was such a chemical. And then when we found out there might be something in the water, we had no idea what it was called. Nor did we know that they used about 6 different names for the same chemical. And the only way we figured that out was because of the way this case developed and when it developed. You know, this case started in 1998. And back then, you know, the way the legal process worked is, yeah, you asked the other side for their documents. And in those days, they either opened up their files to you and you came and actually physically went through them, or they sat down and they copied everything and sent them to you. That's what happened here. And so, yes, lots and lots of boxes of documents came. And in fact, that continued for over a decade, millions of pages of documents. And I had a kind of unique process, as you saw in the film. They accurately recreated that, where I would sit on the floor with a bag of popcorn and coffee and then go through these boxes and physically put everything in chronological order. And for me, at least the way my brain worked, I needed to see this stuff and lay it out and see, you know, and actually read these documents in order just to piece things together. And it took quite a while, but I don't think we could have done that if we had to do it today with the way the computer systems are. So yeah, that was a lot of paper. It was a lot of time. And, you know, I really have to give credit to the folks at Participant, who, particularly Todd Haynes and the director and the folks who really wanted to make sure this was done accurately and to really show what it was really like to go through this process. And, you know, and frankly, a lot of it was tedious and stretched out over many, many years. And you definitely see that in the film.
Well, one of the issues that I have is that basically the corporations have controlled uh, the legal system so that it's virtually impossible. For example, I mean, liability. There are oil refineries that spew out chemicals. People get cancer. I've interviewed workers and people who live in their schools, and there's no liability because the hospitals don't have an analysis. They don't have reports of where they lived. The relationship of pollution to workers' health and safety and communities are very difficult to prove. And it seems to me that that is a real fundamental problem. If you can't prove liability within the capital system, then you can't get damages. And that, it seems like that's gotten worse, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. That is a basic fundamental issue with the way our legal system is set up. And in fact, I wrote a book called Exposure, which was sort of the background of this whole story. It goes into a lot more detail about what was happening legally. And there's just a lot more detail. It's the same story you saw in Dark Waters, but just I describe a little more of what's going on. And I focus on this particular issue in one part of the book as well, where, if you're exposed to something in the environment in our country, you, the exposed person, it's your burden when you walk into a courtroom to prove that that chemical is hurting you and making you sick. The company doesn't have any burden. They can sit there and throw rocks and poke holes in your case. But when you think about it, you, the exposed person, have to come in and prove that a chemical like this one, for example, is causing you harm and is actually making you sick. Yet you're told that under our legal system, the burden requires that you come forward with not just animal studies and test data, but you have to have, the company will say, well, that's not relevant. There's no human data. And to have human data, and to have particularly data that can connect exposure of chemicals to, say, cancer, that requires tens of thousands of people. And we saw that in this case, where we had unequivocal studies linking this chemical to cancer in laboratory animals, all right? And the whole reason, of course, you do the laboratory animal cancer study is to predict human cancer. That's the whole purpose. We don't care if the rats get cancer, all right? We're trying to predict human cancer. Yet even though Dupont itself, in 1988, after the first animal study came back, confirming it, PFOA caused cancer in the rats. And guess which kind of cancer? Testicular, all right? The same thing that we end up proving. DuPont's position was, yeah, but that's not human data. That's irrelevant. Then we pointed to the worker studies. And then we were told, yeah, but that's not enough. Those aren't big enough studies. You don't have enough people. There's not enough cases. You can't draw statistically valid conclusions from that. So that's why when we sat down, knowing, I'd been working in this legal system for many years, and I knew what was going to be required at trial and how almost impossible that burden is. If you're the exposed person, how are you going to come in with studies with tens of thousands of people when the only people that have the money to do studies like that are the companies? And they're not doing those studies. The government doesn't have the money to do it. So that's why we set up this massive study. And we ended up using DuPont's money to have that study done, to finally do a big enough study that would have tens of thousands of people that was able to finally confirm that. It's one of the only times in our history in the US where the exposed people have actually been able to do that, have actually been able to get the science to prove that connection with disease and actually meet that burden. And one of the things I'm trying to work on right now is really trying to find ways to fix this problem. There's legislation being proposed now, particularly with respect to PFAS chemicals, to try to hold the companies responsible if they sit back and say, there's not enough science to say whether this chemical is causing harm or not. Well, then they need to be making the money available for independent scientists to do those studies. So I actually, after the close of this case that you see in the film, I have filed a new case in Ohio, the same courts you saw there, Southern District Federal Court in Ohio, where we're seeking to bring a national class action on behalf of everyone in the United States that have these chemicals in their blood. And it's not for money. but it's to have the studies done, because the companies are sitting back saying, well, there's not enough data. There's no science to prove not any of these cause harm. Well, the idea behind this new study is the companies should be ordered to make the funds available to do whatever studies are big enough to tell us what these chemicals are doing to us. In that case, we're still waiting to see right now whether we're allowed to go forward on behalf of a class. Sorry for that long answer, but I mean, this is what you just hit on is a critical problem. And I think one you see emphasized in this film, you know, how long it takes for the exposed people to ever get through that process. And this, again, was one of the only times we ever did it. And people shouldn't have to do that. I mean, as a lawyer, I'll be the first one to tell you, shouldn't have to be going into court, hiring lawyers, and having to come in and prove whether these chemicals are making you sick or not, particularly when it costs tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It's almost impossible to do that.
Okay.
That's why discussions like this, I think, are so important, to have people talking about these issues and realizing this is really the way it works. And this is what needs to be fixed, is burdens of proof and how these things actually move through the court systems and how science is actually used in those processes.
Another couple of points I want to make. One is the fact we don't have national health care in this country. Means that if there are diseases in a particular area, the hospitals don't collect the information. There's no national database, very hard to find. And then you have workers' compensation, which you have private agreements, non-disclosure agreements. So if there's a systemic problem, it's very difficult to learn about that and prevents you from showing statistically what's going on as far as cancers and other diseases that people get, which we have in the problem in the Bay Area with Hunters Point Shipyard and Treasure Island, which are radioactive nuclear dumps. People have been contaminated and they want to build condos on them. But the other issue I wanted to raise, and that is the capture of OSHA and EPA by the very agencies are supposed to, but companies are supposed to regulate. And this is a serious problem in the Bay Area. A federal OSHA investigator, Daryl Whitman, was making determinations that people have been fired for making health and safety complaints. He was fired, as well as 3 other lawyers in the office. But it seems the regulatory agencies themselves have been captured by the companies, and that has happened throughout the country, actually. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, it's another thing I think you see referenced in the film, and again, I talk about it in a lot more detail in the book. You know, we saw this happen directly in West Virginia, where the lawyers that were actually representing Dupont on PFOA issues, all right, negotiated a deal with the state of West Virginia to set up that team that you saw when they went to court and they came up with this magic new 150 part per billion number. Those lawyers then, once that deal is set, they leave the private law firms representing Dupont and they become the head of the division of air, the division of water, the legal division, and the head of the entire state EPA. So the DuPont lawyers then become the ones enforcing the very deal that they struck. And we saw this again with the US EPA as well. Those of you who've had a chance to see, there's a documentary on this story called The Devil We Know. I think you can still see it on Netflix. And there you'll see that there were some former US EPA folks that actually then went to work for DuPont and helped them negotiate the phase out of this chemical in 2005 and negotiate with US EPA. And they actually helped draft EPA's public statements about these chemicals. It was rather eye-opening, to say the least. So yeah, there's a lot of regulatory capture. And again, I think it's important for people to understand, you know, this is how things work. This is how this really happens. Because, yeah, I don't know how many people that have come up to us after seeing this movie and say, you know, how can this happen? You know, this is the United States. This is not the 1940s. I mean, this is during the 1990s and the 2000s. How could this kind of thing actually occur? And again, it's because of the way our legal system's set up, the way the scientific process and how science is generated, how the regulatory process is set up and captured in many senses. All of that combined to create this perfect storm that created, you know, the worldwide mass contamination that we see now.
Okay, Ashley has a question.
Yeah, hi. First, I just want to say, Rob, so much admiration and respect for you and all the work you've done. You're a hero of mine. I'm a law student. I have an engineering background and a science background, and I got poisoned last year in an apartment on a poorly remediated hazardous waste site. Other people are sick too. And I quickly realized the entire system is broken, like every part of it. And especially being someone, I'm at a law school with all these people helping me, and I can try to learn the science, but just there's like no rights, and everything's impossible to uphill, especially if it's big corporations who are the responsible parties, which they seem to always be. And so there's one specific part that really keeps me up at night though, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So all of this is very technical, and it takes a lot to learn just the basics of how it even works. And if there's a lot of specialties. And companies seem to go out of their way to not have data easily accessible or to make sure there's no community education. Because how do you even know what's going on around you if you don't even know what questions to ask, or that some of these things could be impacting your health? And the press seems to avoid this stuff like the plague. And you happen to get yourself a blockbuster movie and a New York Times profile and all of this, which seems like magic. So what tips do you have for getting people to listen to things about that is essentially chemistry and land use and public health policy, but to actually grab onto it, understand this is important and we need to learn this vocabulary?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and one I've been trying to discuss every chance I get, which is that people need to be able to get outside of their own silos. The lawyers, this is a case, for example, where you see that this involved a lot more than just working the legal case. We had to actually start working and dealing with the science and with the scientists and with the media and the PR people and the legislator, the regulatory system. Had to be understanding all of that and understanding how all of those processes were working at the same time. And it's so important to find ways to effectively communicate, not only within those different silos, but between them, that have science. Some of the scientists were doing amazing work, but none of it was the public wasn't aware of it. The regulators weren't aware. It wasn't making its way into the legal system, or things were going on in the legal world, but nobody understood that or could follow what was going on there. It was all highly technical. And so, this whole process has really educated me in the ever evolving and ever changing need to find different and better ways to communicate and cross over between different groups. And at first I kind of worked within the legal system, trying to submit things to the court and to the sending letters to the agencies, thinking that will start everything moving, and then starting to realize it requires more than that. It was reaching out to environmental groups like the Environmental Working Group and others that could make information available online. And then working with the media. And like you say, it's incredibly difficult to get anything like this mentioned even in the media, particularly the national media. These are complicated stories. They're highly scientific. There's a lot of law. It stretches lots of years. Everything now has been, consolidated into little 5-second sound bites. And if you can't condense your story into this little sound bite, they move on. And so even in this case, we were able to find new ways to bring the information out, like the New York Times article, the book, the documentary, having a feature film made. Yet you still see how even when the film came out, it was incredibly difficult to get anybody to even mention that film existed. Then we had, of course, the pandemic and everything shut down. But, it's very difficult to communicate. And I've been talking with folks in different universities and colleges and folks as well as, to how to help bridge that gap. Because highly scientific, technical issues like this, and being able to communicate to the public so that they understand, why does this matter to me? And so I think that's one of the powerful things about this film. It shows how this problem actually affected real people, real communities in real places. And at the end, I think you see why it affects all of us. This is in all of our water. It's in the blood of all of us, our kids. This is not just a farmer in West Virginia or some small town somewhere that, you know, nobody cares about. This is everywhere now. And so I think, you know, hopefully when people see the film, they realize that, you know, one person can make a huge difference by standing up and speaking out. Somebody like Mr. Tennant, who didn't take no for an answer. You know, somebody like Joe Kiger, who the community pushed back, you know, hey, these are our jobs. This is the big employer in town. But they had the courage to stand up and speak out. And it took a long time, but people are now listening. We're seeing federal legislation being proposed for the first time. We're seeing international laws now being proposed. You know, things I thought I'd never see happen, but it all came from getting this story out and having people talk about it. You know, and I don't want us to miss our opportunity. I know we've got Jeff Grover on the line too, and you know, he was in that incredible cast. And again, the folks that worked on that movie, I think, did an amazing job at getting that story out and, you know, showing what those real people did. And, you know, I can't thank Jeff enough and the folks that worked on the film, you know, for doing what they did and taking the risk that they did to get this out.
Before we go to Joe, there was another question. NA, I don't know who that is. NA had their hand up.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to ask a couple questions, and I don't know if you can maybe just answer them briefly, but what would you say right now are the kind of unknown but serious on this scale environmental concerns that need to be dealt with is one question that should receive publicity. The second question is, how has the law changed in terms of class action, the rise of arbitration? How has that affected these kind of suits, if at all they've affected them? And then I have actually two brief questions. One, like, how has your relationship with the firm changed? Because, you know, this is very unusual as it's predicted the firm. You know, I'm actually married to somebody who used to work in a big, you know, one of these big firms and did environmental law. And it's impossible to get a job later, you know, if you kind of trade or something like that. It's very hard. And then the last thing, what happened to Steve Dozner in this? And like, what is your knowledge of what happened to Steve Dozner and Chevron in that case? Like, why did that turn out so badly?
I'll start backwards, I guess. I'm familiar with the Donziger issue, I guess the Chevron case, just that it exists. I don't know much about it, so I really can't comment. I really don't know the facts of that case. I just have been seeing the headlines that come across the legal news wires, including tonight. I saw some ruling tonight. You know, and I am still at the same law firm, Taft Stettinius, in Cincinnati. It'll now be 30 years. I am still there, still working on these kinds of cases. And as far as, you know, the extent to which the law has changed, if anything, it's become more difficult to pursue big class actions. Like you saw in the film, we were fortunate. Again, a lot of things had to align just right for this story to have worked out the way it did. And one of those was the fact that the state of West Virginia's Supreme Court had recently recognized this new type of claim called medical monitoring. That we were able to use and we're able to actually use on a class-wide basis. And there have been a lot of attempts since then to really cut back on that and make it a lot more difficult to do that all across the country. So if anything, it's become even more difficult to bring claims like this, much more difficult. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the very first question.
Oh, just what are the kind of biggest fights that are that's undertaken now?
Honestly, you know, I am spending almost all my time focused on PFAS. We are handling hundreds of cases across the U.S. Right now. You may have seen in the newspaper about, for example, firefighting foam contamination in water all across the U.S. These chemicals. You know, they're now in cosmetics, they're in the food, they're everywhere. So there's litigation now all over the U.S. So I'm staying pretty busy on that. What I'm hoping is that there aren't any others that are this bad, that are man-made toxins that are persistent, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic, that are out there that stay in our environment virtually forever. They don't break down and stay in us. Yeah, we just happened to find out about this because of a farmer in West Virginia with cows dying. And it makes you wonder, what other ones don't we know about, that we just haven't found out about yet? I'm hopeful that none are this bad and on this big of a scale. But, unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of unregulated chemicals like this. You have to keep in mind, the US EPA didn't come into existence until 1970. The first federal laws really regulating new chemicals, 1976. So there were tens and tens of thousands of chemicals already out there by that point. This was one of them. This is sort of your classic example here. And the general rule was, it's up to the companies to report to the EPA if there's some reason they ought to go look at those existing chemicals. And this was one of those cases where the companies didn't tell them, didn't report it, and covered it up. And hopefully there aren't a lot of others like this, but we just don't know.
Well, there's an epidemic of cancer in the United States. And basically the people get cancer for reasons. It's not just because they happen to have it. There are reasons that you do get cancer. The problem has been, one, there's no correlation. We have as I said earlier, if there are epidemics of cancer, even at nuclear plants or something like that, it's very difficult to find out because of the no healthcare, and the healthcare agencies are private. You have private healthcare. But the other question is criminal liability. None of these people go to prison and jail are prosecuted for poisoning people. And these executives don't go to jail, which is another issue. I mean, if they went to prison, if they went to jail and were held accountable, that would certainly change the atmosphere, but that never really happens in most cases.
Yeah, think about it with the health issues. Typically, if you're in a legal setting and you're trying to show that some chemical has caused, human harm, you're trying to show that you've got a group that's got higher levels of some cancer or some element than the general population, right? And so you try to use a quote control, unexposed group to compare to. What do you do when you have chemicals like this that are in everyone's blood, and they are in our blood at levels of significant concern? And there is no quote clean comparison group. And so when you start looking at nationwide health issues, and you start realizing you've got things like this that are in everyone's blood, how do you show that? And so it becomes incredibly difficult. And on the criminal side, it's extremely difficult because we can bring civil cases in court, but it's up to the government agencies, to decide whether to prosecute somebody criminally. And as you saw in the film, the U.S. Department of Justice initiated a criminal investigation back in 2005. And after a deal was struck with EPA and Dupont agreed to phase out any further production of this chemical over 10 years, in which it phased in these new related chemicals. But after that deal was cut, then the Department of Justice inexplicably dropped the criminal investigation. So to this day, nobody has gone to jail over any of that.
Harvey?
And that's a concern. People want to know, why, how is it? Because, if somebody went out and injected you, stuck a needle in your arm and injected you with something, they'd probably get in trouble for that criminally. Or if somebody went out and dumped things directly into your water, that would be a problem. Yet when it's done through a corporate emission of things into the environment, it's handled in a very different way.
Harvey?
Yeah, one quick question. As you said, we're talking about tens of thousands of chemicals, and most of them not studied. But what strikes me is that for all those individual chemicals, you would also have to study the interaction between all the chemicals, and it becomes, exponentially, complicated. So is anyone even considering looking at that? Because it seems to me that the threats are just, you know, it's kind of astounding how huge the threats are.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and even particularly with these PFOS chemicals, you know, typically, of course, when you have lab animals, you can control what other chemicals they're exposed to. You can control them from birth and make sure they're only exposed to this chemical. But, you know, as humans, we're not that way. We've got other chemicals, we've got other things in our bodies that are interacting, you know, and synergistically. All of this is mixing together. And you know, there's a lot of scientists in the scientific community, a lot of folks in the regulatory community that are focused on this and are saying, you know, we really need to be focusing on this broader exposure and synergistic mixing of stuff. And you know, because a lot of this could have effects that you don't see in any of these laboratory studies. And you won't see them unless you actually look at the human impacts, and it's extremely difficult to do that.
Jeffrey, why don't you talk about your experience working on the film? We haven't heard from you and what it was like working on this film.
Thanks. Well, first of all, it's humbling, and thank you. I mean, to be, Carol was nice enough. She's related to an always relative of mine, my former mother-in-law. And I've never met Carol in person, but we've talked. And Steve, I met you on the phone a few weeks ago. And so I'm really honored because she knew this film was something I was a part of. You know, what's most interesting, and Rob, thank you. I think you folks should know that he is in demand for his time. And as you saw in the film, he has a balance with his family and his firm and his community. So really, you know, he's the one you should really, really appreciate, okay? My role in the film was serendipity. Thank you. Playing Edward Wallace, which was actually a pseudonym for another actual Dupont attorney whose name will not be mentioned. It was pretty cool, but I realized, gosh, I'm such a nice person, and this guy's such an asshole, you know. But pardon my French, but however, at the same, I hope I didn't offend anybody. And Rob, and all due respect to you and your family, he was still fighting for what he believed, you know, and he was representing his firm, and you know, and doing what he needed to do. And I think if you watch the argument, and I think Rob mentioned it, the way that they were trying to get the dismissal based on 150 parts per billion, and we're below that, and the fact that we monitor our firm monitors our own limits, et cetera, and we're below that and below the state of West Virginia and the several districts. It was kind of interesting to be able to go into that moment, and just as one thing to say, and this is just as an aside, because normally when I do plays or things like that or theater, films, people say, well, what's it like? What's the first question people ask, Steve? And they'll say, how do you memorize those lines? And it's like, I think you're kind of missing the point. But the director, Todd Haynes, and Mark Ruffalo in particular, and obviously Rob and the team, and Christine Vachon and everybody involved, were so committed to the idea of this. And I remember Todd Haynes came up to me during the courtroom scene, and he said, you know, Jeff, I tell you what, really let that word Teflon, taste that word. And Rob, you saw we did that like, I don't know, 40 or 50 times with the reverses and the whys and all the courtroom things. And I was like, yeah, Teflon. And when I say, you know, that I don't know what I say exactly, but it basically brings housewives, house persons, I'm sorry. I mean, it's everything that my daughter Megan and everybody would say, you know, stop it. But I love saying it because it advanced the film. And I think in a sense, when I watched it tonight, and Steve, I did watch it, and Rob sent an email saying every time he watches it, he sees something new. I'm so proud to be associated with it because it really advances the story, and that, you know, everybody involved, they're just trying to do the right thing. And I think that's what's important, is that things that people appear to be doing as the right thing, you have to really dig underneath and not make assumptions.
And one of the issues is West Virginia, which has an important history of struggle, class struggle, the miners' union, and yet today, a right-wing movement, people are afraid of losing their jobs. That's always been the case, that workers and people in the community are afraid that if a big company comes in and you fight that company, you'll end up lost, without jobs, without income. And that's a reality for working people, which unfortunately has been used politically, I think, in this period massively.
Could I just put something in here? I just want to explain that I'm not from West Virginia, but I spent a lot of time there studying and also working on water quality. And West Virginia has, I guess, better than California has, grassroots groups that check their own water. And so all the water, the headwaters for several states around starts on Cheat Mountain, where I have a lot of family. And they have a whole network of people as you go down from Cheat Mountain that are always checking the water, always. So when this is described as a really complicated thing, legally speaking, that may be the case, but checking on your water in your river is not necessarily that complicated. And I also just wanted to say, oh, and I love how this film is so respectful of the people of West Virginia. That's really rare to see about any Appalachian depiction. It's just hard to find. So it's extraordinary in that way to me as well. And I'd love to know if it's still the largest epidemiological study today, because it certainly was at the time. And it makes it, I love that it takes some time for the lawyers to say, oh, people aren't going to respond to this. And then to reveal that it was so large and people were so enthusiastic about participating. That is very meaningful to me. And then I just want to say that if you want to be part of watching the water in West Virginia, they're still doing that trick that is so well depicted in this film of changing the water quality standards. Whoops, just changing them. And as soon as they are tempted to do that, and it's been done a lot this year, they try to change those standards, but the word goes out, and if enough people show up at the hearings, well, then they'll postpone it for a while or stop it. So this is something we really can play a huge role in. Even if you're out in California, you can get these little alerts and send something in. I'm sorry, Jeffrey, I just interrupted yours. You probably have a lot more to say, but I wanted to throw that in there.
I have nothing else to say. I yield.
I was going to say that we were really fortunate that there were videotaped depositions of Mr. Tennant and his wife, Sandra, and their brothers. And so, like the actor Bill Camp, who played Mr. Tennant, was able to watch those videos. And there were other snippets of various people. So, what you saw, for example, with his accent and the way he dressed, I mean, that was spot on. And in fact, his Mr. Tennant, unfortunately, had passed away, and so had his wife. But when we were filming, his brother, Jim, who you see in a cameo there with his wife, they came up and watched some of the filming, and were just blown away by how spot on he was. And so it's, again, everybody in the cast just did a fantastic job with capturing those real people, and including, as Jeff was saying, the Dupont lawyers were doing their job. And in fact, what we ended up seeing was the Dupont lawyers were trying to convince the company to do the right thing. We ended up getting emails that were produced in the case, where the lawyers were actually quite frustrated. How we got those was a whole nother story. It was a very complex story, but showing that these attorneys were trying to get the company to give people water, and were very frustrated that they were not being listened to. So it's not like these are just one-sided characters here, and I think they did a great job doing that.
Okay, we have a question from George.
Yes. I not hopped in late, but I heard somebody talking about the question of how this is not treated as criminal law. It's not treated as criminal law. And I talk about the movie Aaron Brockovich, in some way, I consider that movie to be, very detrimental in fact, in actuality, in terms of regulating and protecting public health. Because in that movie, what you see, our corporation is a corporation willfully, knowingly mass poisoning the public to the extent that they're paying for their medical bills in an effort to cover this up. And this is where I critique the movie, that the happy ending is the payout. I mean, that's not a happy ending. That's a shocking ending. That in the end, all that is done is paid out. Here you have people that are willfully, knowingly murdering people, slowly poisoning them, really killing them in the most painful way possible. And all they have is a payoff. And so really what it reflects, we have a legal regime where really we're back in the age of aristocracy, where there are elements of society that are quite frankly above the law. The difference between now and the feudal era is that level of damage that the aristocracy could do at any one time was limited. But today, we basically have these billion-dollar corporations, which are deemed, too big to fail, and they're killing people, and they're poisoning people, and they're destroying the planet, and there's not any even serious discussion about putting anyone on the docket. I mean, it's just a really, really completely shocking. It's a shocking situation, right? That people can get away with wantonly killing people in the course of profit taking.
Yeah, well, I think it raised the question of the system. I mean, both the Democrats and Republicans take money from these same companies, and even under Democrats, Republicans, under the administrations of both parties, you have corruption and capture of these government agencies. I know OSHA in California, for example, in the middle of a pandemic, a year after a pandemic, has less OSHA inspectors that they had even before the pandemic. So why is that? In this pandemic, which has threatened health and safety of the entire population, you would think that there would be a major increase in OSHA investigators, health and safety, and yet it's the agency that's responsible for health and safety is being bled and being squeezed. So it's a system problem, and unfortunately, politically, we don't have a Labor Party. There's no political alternative to the Democrats and Republicans, and that's why there's a lot of anger and frustration. Ashley again?
Yeah, I want to ask Rob if he has any advice for us of how we can actually try to make a difference. Like, the more I've been exposed to this, the more I'm like, it's broken. This needs to be different. I want to change things. But every time I try to do something, it feels like whack-a-mole, and it is so uphill. Like, everything takes so much energy, and then just another thing pops up, or they find a way to work around it. And then when I talk to people that are also like that, they're like, what? We have all this energy of wanting to change things, and then when you sit there and feel so powerless, you're just like, but what can we even do? Like, I think you've made such a huge dent. Any advice you have would be so appreciative.
Yeah, I think the first thing is, I guess, just to realize it takes time, and it's a long process. But again, going back to what I was saying before, that each person can make a huge difference. And just having these discussions, getting these kinds of stories out there, talking about these kinds of things, is helping spread the word, is critical. And it takes a while, but you eventually get to sort of a critical momentum starting to build on certain issues. Like with this, it took 20 years, to get this story to where we're actually now talking about this, and we're actually starting to get legislation being proposed and regulations being changed, and people out testing their water for the first time. So it took a long time, and it took many different attempts, to find different ways to advance the story and to advance that. And, eventually all of those little steps built upon each other to where we're at now. And, there was for example, on PFOS, with the launch of the film, participant, one of the things they also did was a social media campaign. And they called fightforeverchemicals.com. And, went on to social media and worked with different environmental groups and organizations in different communities, not only in the US, but abroad as well, to try to help people have a forum for sharing information, making, if they wanted to try to figure out how do I help, or how, what kind of organizations can I join, they were able to do that. And, just a quick comment about the Aaron Brockovich, it's the interesting tidbits from the movie, just getting back to the movie too, was, the same photographer from Aaron Brockovich actually did the photography for Dark Waters, Ed Lockman. And I think you see a very different type of ending in this film, where in this film at the end we're still going. There isn't this everything is rosy and it's all fixed. That this is a continuing battle that's continuing to this day. So a very different approach at the end.
This is Denise. Thank you. Thank you to LaborFest for showing this. And it was extremely encouraging to me. I'm involved in a David and Goliath type situation too, involving publicly supported nonprofit housing and all kinds of conflict of interest and criminal behavior and stuff. But Rob, my question for you is, one is, how did you protect yourself and your family and, like your evidence, fighting against, this dangerous, powerful company for all these years? And secondly, how did you keep up your employment and your morale when this thing was like so protracted? Thank you.
Not to shamelessly plug my book, but that's one of the things I get into in a lot more detail in my book, is just, what was going on during that period of time. And but again, one of the things that I think tried to do was get information out, get it into the public domain. You saw at the very beginning, and this really happened. When I first sent information to the US EPA, the company tried to get a gag order, to prevent me from even sharing that information. Luckily, that was rejected. But I tried to find ways to make sure that information was in the public domain, into the EPA records, in court filings, so that information was out there and available. And because for me, the more that information's out there, the less there's any ability to try to think you can keep it quiet or keep it covered up. And so again, all of this has been trying to find ways to help achieve that, getting the information out and making sure that there's no ability to cover it up again. When you watch the movie, you see there's a point in time around 2003 where this was starting to kind of filter out to the general public. There was the 2020 show with Barbara Walters. That was November of 2003. I mean, think about that. That was, how many, I don't do math, but 15, whatever, how many years ago that was. It all then went away, right? For another decade. After Dupont strikes this deal with the EPA to phase the chemical out, everything just went away for another 10 years. It all did get covered back up again. And it took all of this additional effort, the New York Times story and all of this information to finally push it back out again. I think we're at the point where it can't be pushed back under the rug again. But it's a long struggle to do that.
Okay, well, I think we've had a very valuable discussion, and I've learned a lot. I think it's important that working people, especially in this country, learn the lessons of your struggle. So I want to thank very much Rob for joining us, and Jeffrey, and we're recording this, as I put in the chat, and we'll have it available so people can learn from this film, and hopefully more people can see the film, because it's a very powerful film about the reality of fighting for health and safety, a clean environment, which we all face today in the United States and around the world as well.
Well, thanks so much. It was really a pleasure joining you. Thanks, Jeffrey, for inviting me in, and thank you to everybody for this event. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.